Thank you for joining our webinar today. So my name is Janine Jaffrey. I'm the stewardship technician at the Nature Trust, and today we're going to talk about Blandings turtles. Hopefully you'll learn a little bit about where they live, what they look like to eat, and also a little bit about what the Nature Trust has been doing to help this at-risk species on our conservation lands, and also what you could do on your lands to help these turtles as well. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and I'll see if I can answer them for you. Okay. So the Nature Trust has been working to protect Nova Scotia's outstanding natural legacy through land conservation since 1994. As a non-government, non-advocacy land trust, we focus on the securement of ecologically significant lands that are privately owned. Part of the reason that why we do this is so important is because Nova Scotia is in more of a unique position compared to the other provinces that we have in Canada, because about 65% of Nova Scotia is privately owned, which if you compare that to say 5% in BC or 8% in Quebec or 13% in Ontario, 65% is quite a large area that's privately owned, and is thus this large area is also vulnerable to development and habitat destruction. So our mandate at the Nature Trust is to save some of this privately owned land that is ecologically significant. And we do this by contacting and working with landowners to try and secure these lands through maybe donation or through purchase or through conservation easements. So as part of our work at the Nature Trust, we have been working on this turtle power project for the last few years. In 2020, we applied to the Habitat Stewardship Program to get funding to support in the recovery and the conservation of two at-risk turtle species that we find on our conservation lands. And these are the wood turtle and the Blandings turtle. So this is the part where I have to say this project was undertaken with the financial support of the Government of Canada through the Federal Department of Environment and Climate Change. And at the moment, I'm not sure if you can see me. I think, Jess, are you there? I think you may have taken over my video, but that's okay.
Oh, I am. It gives me the option to reclaim host. I can see you, although I don't know if that's...
You can see me?
Just me. Yeah, I can.
Okay, I'm sure everybody else can too. That's okay. Okay, so back to our Turtle Power project. We had three kind of main components to our project. The first was to continue to secure ecologically significant properties that contain turtle habitat around the province. Secondly, we wanted to do some on-the-ground stewardship and conservation work to improve the turtle habitat that we have in our conservation lands. And thirdly, we wanted to provide the opportunity for the public to learn a little bit about this species at risk, and also help them to learn how they can help in their recovery and in their conservation. But before I dive into Blandings turtles specifically, I wanted to give you a few facts about the freshwater turtles that we find in Nova Scotia. So we have 4 species of freshwater turtle: eastern painted turtle, the common snapping turtle, the wood turtle, which is a threatened species found on the St. Mary's River, and also the Blandings turtle, which we're here to talk about today. So a few general facts about freshwater turtles. Like most reptiles, turtles are ectothermic, which means that they are cold-blooded and they can't produce their own heat. So they rely on external heat sources to warm them up. And this is why, especially on like cold spring mornings, you'll see turtles and other like reptiles and snakes out basking in the sun because they have to warm up before they can get going. Throughout a year, turtles have 3 critical life history periods. The active season, which is when they're out and about, is like generally spring until late fall. There's the nesting season, which is when the females go out to lay their eggs. And then there's the overwintering or the non-active season. Turtles can breed over winter or early in the spring or in fall. Their nesting period is from late May into early June, or early July. And during this time, the females will travel out to a nesting site where they will dig a nest to lay their eggs, and then they cover their eggs back over. And this is when the incubation period starts. So the eggs will then develop into hatchlings, and then the hatchlings will emerge from their nest in late summer or into early fall. And then make their way out towards water or to find an overwintering site. Sadly, very few hatchlings will actually survive into adulthood and breed. Most will be either predated upon or they'll die from like anthropogenic sources, like, for example, getting squashed on a road. To survive the colder months, turtles will find a hibernaculum and they'll go into a type of hibernation which is called brumation. And brumation is specific to reptiles and amphibians. Some turtles will hibernate by themselves, or some will hibernate in groups of just their own species or mixed species groups. They like to dig themselves into the soft mud at the bottom of pools, or into like undercut banks or streams, and they'll wedge themselves under like submerged rocks, and then they'll stay there for the winter period, and they'll rely on their stored energy. They have such lowered metabolic rates during brumation that they just breathe by uptaking oxygen from the water around them via osmosis. So that's how they survive the winter. Turtles also have what's considered a slow life history, and there's a few characteristics that define this. So the first of it is that they have a really long lifespan, with some species being able to live, 80 to 100 plus years. Secondly, they only become sexually mature and only able to breed quite late in life. So for freshwater species that we have here, that's generally between 12 and 25 years old. And this means that some species have a really long generation times. So there's a long time between one generation and the next. And for our freshwater turtles, that's about 25 to 40 years, which is almost double that of humans. So they have a really long generation time. Sexually mature females won't necessarily breed every year. They can breed every year, but sometimes they'll only breed every 3 years. And when they do, and they lay a clutch, they'll lay on average 1 to 25 eggs per clutch. Once the hatchlings survive, they face many, many threats. And as I said before, many of them don't survive to reach sexual maturity. Now, all of this together means that the survival of the turtle populations are really dependent on high annual adult survival. And this also means that it will take a really long time for the turtle populations to recover and for them to reach a point where they're no longer considered to be an at-risk species. So this brings us to the main event, the Blandings turtle. The species was named after a man called Dr. William Blanding. I looked him up on the internet, and he was born in Massachusetts, and he lived from like the 1770s to the 1850s. He was a physician that ran an apothecary, but he was also an amateur naturalist, and he had a collection, a specimen collection that he then donated to the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences, and this is how the Blandings turtle kind of got its name. Now, the Nova Scotia population of Blandings turtles was first assessed by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, CSIWC, in 1993, and it was initially designated as threatened. So CSIWC is an advisory panel of scientists and researchers who identify species at risk and then designate their conservation status. And then they make recommendations to the Minister of Environment. So CSIWC first assessed the Blandings turtle in 1993, and then the turtle was then reassessed in 2005, and their conservation status was elevated up to endangered, which then resulted in the year after the species was added to Schedule 1 of the Species at Risk Act. So what do they look like? Relative to other North American freshwater turtle species, Blandings are medium in size. They have a smooth domed carapace, which is the top shell, which is kind of a black to dark green color, and it's got yellow spots and flecks on it. Their most characteristic identifying feature is their bright yellow chin and throat, which you can see on the slide, and their scales and their skin is black and yellow. Their neck is long, and they have a mouth which curves upward into the form of a nice little smile. Their plastron is the bottom shell, is kind of orangey yellow in color, and each scoot has black splotches on the outside. A scoot is what each of the individual plates that make up the turtle shell, that's what that's called. So there is a way to kind of tell between males and females in Blandings. So the male Blandings turtles have a more concave plastron, whereas the females have a flat plastron, and the males are concave so they can breed or mate. In Canada, there are two separate populations. There's the smaller isolated population in Nova Scotia, but then we also have a population which is known as the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Blandings turtle population, and it makes up the majority of this species that we have here. The Blandings are also found in the northeastern United States, and they go from Maine down into South Dakota and in a bit of Nebraska and south into Illinois and Indiana as well. In Nova Scotia, turtles appear to be restricted to the southwestern interior of the province, which is called Gasputwik. There's been various studies that have been done on their movement, and there's also been genetic assessment. And from this, it's been revealed that Nova Scotia has 3 distinct subpopulations that are genetically distinguishable from each other, and they're separated by about at least 15 kilometers. So the largest subpopulation that we have is the Kedji-Makujik population, and it occurs on the Mersey River watershed and is almost entirely within Kedji-Makujik National Park. So this population is probably the largest because it's been protected for the longest time. There are other 2 smaller, but still 2 other smaller subpopulations that occur on the Medway watershed. And this is the McGowan Lake population, which you can see in red. And then there's the Pleasant River population as well. And these 2 subpopulations occur on what we call working landscapes. So there's agriculture and forestry and industry, and there's cottages and residences in these landscapes. So these turtles face many more threats than what the Kedji-Makujik one does. There's also been 2 smaller concentrations that have been identified. One in the pink is found within the Tobagatic wilderness area on the Sisabu watershed. And the other smaller population is in the light blue, and it's on Dexter Brook, which is also on the Medway watershed. There's also been a few like isolated and unconfirmed sightings, which you can see in yellow. So it's possible there are like more undiscovered subpopulations that we haven't found yet, but also these may have just been, one-off occurrences. So let's talk about their life history. Blandings turtles hibernate, they go into brumation over the winter, and then they're active from about late March or April, so around about now, when the ice melts, until September or into early October. It can take these turtles up to 25 years to reach sexual maturity, and once they do, they don't necessarily breed every year. On average, the females will lay between 6 and 13 eggs per clutch. However, Nova Scotia clutch size is known to differ among the different subpopulations. Blandings turtles are polygamous, and individuals may mate with more than one or with multiple partners. And the females have the ability to store sperm, so clutches can have multiple sires. And as a female gets older, her clutch size and her egg size and the number of sires for her clutch increases. It's positively correlated with her age. So older females have a higher probability with mating with non-resident males as well. So older females are particularly important in maintaining genetic connectivity between the wetlands. Females will dig their nests in late May into early July, and they like open areas with lots of sun exposure. And the hatchlings, or the eggs, I suppose, will need this sun exposure and heat for the incubation period. And this typically lasts around about 80 days, but it depends on the site. Now, the egg's temperature during development determines the gender of the hatchling, and this is called temperature-dependent sex determination. Males are produced when the eggs are incubated at 28 degrees C and lower, and females are produced when the temperatures are 30 degrees and higher. And in between those temperatures, you get a mix. The eggs, the hatchlings, will pip and hatch out in September and October, and they can live for a really, really long time, 80+ years, if given the opportunity. They have an omnivorous diet, and typically they'll feed underwater, and their diet includes aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates and aquatic vegetation, and crayfish and bivalves and fish eggs and like carrion and frogs and toads and tadpoles. So they eat an awful lot of different things. For their habitat, blandings will use a variety of different habitats over their life cycle. In the summer, you can find them in fens and shallow lake coves and vernal pools. They like slow-flowing brooks and rivers. And within these habitats, they tend to frequent shallow water that's less than 2 meters deep, that contains abundant vegetation, which has like deep organic sediments. They particularly like sites that have sweet kale or sedges that are overhanging the banks. And they like dark-colored water that comes from peaty soils, as well as living sphagnum mats. For their nesting sites, they'll nest in a variety of different substrates, including like soft sand and soil and gravel. And typically they prefer locations that are less than 100 meters from water. But they'll also nest on like slate and on rocky outcrops. And they'll nest in like forest clearings and meadows and shorelines. agricultural fields, along the roadsides and in borrow pits, in vegetable gardens and driveways. So they'll nest in a variety of different places. The females will lay their eggs during the evening and the nighttime hours, and many females, but not all, display high site fidelity to specific nesting areas. So they'll go back to that same nesting site year after year after year. In the winter, the Blandings turtles, the adults and the juveniles will often densely aggregate at their aquatic overwintering sites. So there'll be lots in one area, and they'll again return to those wintering sites year after year. They typically arrive at the overwintering sites in September and October, and they'll leave around about now, just once the ice has melted away in the spring. The habitats that they'll use for their overwintering sites vary, but they include like wooded pools or wooded channels, but they'll also use like railway trenches and coves and things like that, and specific sections of streams and wetlands. And these sites have that deep, soft organic bottoms and undercut banks. So I have a few example pictures. You can see here the slow, dark-moving water with the overhanging vegetation, and there's some sweetgale there and lots of sedges. We have a wooded kind of backwater channel. You've got the dark water, it's probably quite deep, and the sedges overhanging the bank. Here we have a vegetated lake cove, so lots of abundant vegetation for them. And then this picture I included mostly because I liked it, but there's a Blandings turtle. She's out looking for a nesting site on a slate beach. So turtles face many threats to their survival. Like their largest and ongoing threat that they face is habitat loss and habitat degradation and fragmentation. So especially for the Blandings turtles, they live in cottage country. Where there's lake and river shorelines, we like to put cottages, and cottage development degrades, you lose the habitat and also degrades the habitat too. Under this topic, we also have forestry and harvesting. So where we have forestry, if, for example, an area was clear cut, you're not only losing the protection of the trees and the forest, but you're also will likely cause degradation to the aquatic habitats, because once you pull all those trees down, all of the water that the trees were taking up is now going straight into the watershed, and it's also carrying lots of soil and other substrates going straight into the watershed instead of having the trees hold all of that stuff back. In the working landscapes, you also find agriculture and agricultural practices like adding fertilizers to fields. Often an awful lot of this fertilizer will get washed straight into the waterway, and if it ends up in a lake, it could result in eutrophication of the lake. And then we have ATVs and off-highway vehicles. So where someone can have 5 minutes of fun in a wetland, ripping around and ripping up the wetland, it could take you maybe 5 years for that wetland to recover from that damage. Or if it was in, a bog instead, it could take, hundreds of years for that damage to recover from just a short amount of time. Probably the major source of accidental mortality and death for Blandings turtles, and also all of our freshwater turtle species, is probably road networks. And this is especially true during their dispersal and seasonal movements. So roads not only cause direct mortality by if a turtle crosses it and then is startled and gets squashed by a vehicle, they also have indirect impacts as well. And one of these is as known as ecological traps. So a good example of this, an ecological trap, would be when a female is out looking for a nesting site and she comes across this lovely gravel surface, which she would maybe take for a beach. And she would choose then to dig her nest in that spot and cover it over. And she thinks it looks like a really, really great nesting spot, but it isn't, because it's actually a road. Because she's then placed her nest on this road, the nest is then vulnerable to secondary impacts like nest compaction, saying if a truck were to come along and drive over the nest, the eggs would just get squashed. And they're also vulnerable to, for example, naturally higher rates of nest predation, because our generalist predators like, you know, raccoons and fox and skunks and corvids tend to follow linear features. Like if they're looking for roadkill along a road and they've come across a nest, the nest is much more likely to get predated along a road than on a beach. Blandings turtles also face threats, which include changes in natural processes. So this includes increases in spring and fall flooding levels. So if you think again about, you know, clear cutting all along the watershed, all of that water is just going and substrate is just going straight into the rivers. Which then may not directly impact Blandings turtles themselves, but it does impact their food chain. So all of those small aquatic invertebrates that they eat, they're no longer able to live in these conditions. So there's kind of a knock-on effect up the food chain. Other changes in natural processes include reduced water levels and dams construction, and also like dam removal as well. The Blandings turtles really like consistent water levels. And if you think about beaver dam removal, you're losing that consistent water level. So Blandings turtle habitat is actually really strongly associated with the presence of beavers and the wetland habitat that they create and they maintain, because the beaver dams help to keep the water level constant, which is like particularly important in times of drought, and they also help to sustain nutrient levels as well. A further threat that they face is illegal harvesting. And this can be for the pet trade or for consumption. So this can be for adults and juveniles, as well as the hatchlings and their eggs too. It's actually illegal to own a pet turtle or trade in turtles in Nova Scotia because they carry salmonella. So that's not allowed here, but it does still happen. A further threat that they face is what's called human subsidized predators. And this is when you have a naturally elevated predator populations. So these predator populations are supported and higher than what they would be naturally because of human waste. So if you think about, you know, uncovered compost heaps and garbage dumps and roadkill, and things like that, it allows predator populations of corvids and raccoons and skunks and foxes and gulls to be higher than what it would be naturally. So then this at-risk turtle species have more predators that are out there to eat them. Another threat that they face is invasive species too. So there's invasive species like these top fish predators, the smallmouth bass and the chain pickerel. So the smallmouth bass was, I think, legally introduced into Nova Scotia in the 1940s into a couple lakes, and it's now spread out to over like 188 lakes and is still spreading further. Likewise, the chain pickerel is a like a top predator, and it was illegally introduced into 3 lakes in 1945, and it's now present in at least 95 lakes. There's also invasive vegetative species as well, like Phragmites, which is a reed which can grow very, very densely, so densely in fact that the hatchlings aren't able to make their way through this reed to get to the water. So what has the Nature Trust been doing? In Gisputerik, Southwest Nova, has been a focal area for conservation since 2008, and we look for ecologically significant lands where there's endangered species or at-risk birds, and we like old growth forests and freshwater wetlands. And we also try to do large-scale connectivity and make protected land assemblages, because we want to create a corridor of protected lands that these at-risk species can use. Not only the turtle, but other at-risk species like the eastern ribbard snake, and also in Southwest Nova we have the Atlantic coastal plain flora, and that's a suite of at-risk plant species. So at the moment, we steward 25 conservation lands in the area, and 15 of these are considered to be within the Blandings habitat core or critical habitat areas. And at the moment, we're also in the process of securing 3 more, hopefully, 3 more properties as well. So in total, this is about 1,550 acres that we've protected so far. Last year, we also worked on creating a Blandings turtle recovery guidance document. So for this, we did almost like a literature review where we looked at all of the best practices by the provincial government recommendations, and also from other land trusts and for agriculture and forestry. And we took all of these best practices and they put them into one guidance document. And we use this guidance document to inform our stewardship plans for all of our conservation lands. So we want to make sure that we're doing the most that we can to help in the recovery of this at-risk species. So I have a map here. This covers maybe about 40 kilometers, and you can see the hatched over area is Blandings turtles core habitat. And the properties that are in bright yellow are the properties that we secured last year. So we have, this is on the Pleasant River watershed, Upper Pleasant River and Lower Pleasant River. And we went over into the Barron Brook area. And I think this property over here was DeLong Lake, which was quite a large property for us to get. So there's still spots within the critical habitat where there's areas that aren't protected, and we're hoping to fill some of those in. Another project that we worked on in partnership with the Mersey Tobiatic Research Institute, more commonly known as MTRI, and a lot of Blandings turtle conservation work over the years, including on Nature Trust lands. So they've done things like nest protection and emergence surveys. They've done lots of population monitoring, including trapping and release programs, where they notch the turtles to see if they come back again the next year. They've done habitat characterization. They've also done radio tracking of turtles. And they've also they have used some conservation canines before. So these are dogs that have been trained to sniff out and find turtles and turtle nests as well. So here's a picture of some of the nest protectors that we've used on, this is our McGowan Lake property. Now, the use of these nest protectors does require a provincial species at risk permit. You have to have a license to do this. But basically the nest protectors work where we find a nest that hasn't been disturbed yet, and you put the nest protector over it and you wait until you think maybe the incubation period is up, and then you have go back every day or every night and you check to make sure that there's no hatchlings that have emerged. But it just kind of stops all of those predators from predating the nest before the hatchlings have a chance to pick. Another project that we worked on was also at our McGowan Lake property. And we had a certain nesting spot there that up until 2015, we'd had Blandings females coming regularly back to this same nesting spot year after year. But then with time, the vegetation kind of grew up and grew over, and the canopy grew over. So to such an extent that this spot was no longer suitable for nesting because there wasn't enough sun there and there was too much vegetation in the substrate. So for our restoration project, it wasn't terribly complicated, but in March last year, we went to the spot and we cut back all of the overhanging canopy to open up that area again and make it nice and warm so the sun could come in and help incubate these nests. Likewise, we also went back in early May to rake out some of the remaining weeds and vegetation that was there to make the substrate more suitable for nesting again. And we went back in early May because there was the possibility that there may have been some overwintering eastern painted turtles in that area. So this brings us to what you can do on your property. If you have, for example, a cottage property, one of the best things that you can actually do is to maintain the natural vegetation around the shorelines. So if it's on a lake or on wetlands or along the river even, we want to keep those native plant species there. And if you have a lawn, if it's possible, we'd like you either to reduce or remove those lawns and plant only native species. Likewise, eliminating the use of pesticides and herbicides and also like chemical fertilizers is really good because then all of that stuff isn't just running directly into the watershed. If you have a dock, you can build a dock that's floating and isn't dug into the lake bed or the riverbed. And this helps to minimize impacts along the shoreline and also helps the water quality too. Likewise, for water quality, if you have a sewage system there, make sure it's well maintained so it's not flowing into the watershed. And also if you have a compost heap or a garbage pile and your waste, make sure that you dispose of it properly, because if you don't, then you're going to be helping to increase the predator populations that are there. There's this really useful landowner guide that I will post a link to in the chat, which has some really useful tips and tricks. So I have a picture where it says before and after, where they've done shoreline hardening. So in reality, we would want to do the reverse. We would take the after image and turn it into a better version of the before image, where it's wilder and we have maintained that natural vegetation for the turtle species. If you do have land, you have to be careful about creating ecological traps. So, for example, if you have a gravel pile on your land, these can be super attractive to nesting females. The picture here that's included is on a leftover from a new purchase of a new conservation land that we recently got. And so far, we've decided to just leave that there because we know it's being used by nesting females. So the options are either to don't create these piles in the first place, or don't use the piles during the nesting period and during the incubation period as well. If you work in forestry or if you have forested lands, you can plan harvesting activities around about the nesting season. And also if you're on a waterway, maintaining that natural vegetation and maintaining the forest canopy around watercourses is really very important. Likewise, if you're in agricultural lands, if you're doing, for example, hay mowing, you can set your discs higher than 15 centimeters to hopefully avoid hitting turtles and all of the other things that are living in agricultural fields. Another thing that we suggest is the use of a flushing bar. So this is just a bar that hangs in front of the mowers and disturbs the grass before you hit them with the blades, and it gives mostly birds and things a chance to get away before the blades hit them. Again, maintaining natural vegetation around water birdies and practicing proper nutrient management strategies is very important because we don't want that entering the watercourses. What else can you do? Especially during their dispersal and movement season, you want to drive cautiously in areas where you think there are turtles. So if you are driving along and you come across a turtle, you are allowed to stop and pick them up and move them off the road. This is the only time that you're allowed to directly interact with these at-risk turtle species. But you kind of just pick them up like a pizza box and you move them in the direction that they were traveling. If you're into ATVs and off-road vehicles, we'd like for you to stay on the designated ATV tracks and really avoid driving through these sensitive wetland habitats because they take such a long time to recover from disturbance. Lastly, you can tell your friends and your family and your neighbours about Blandings turtles and how they can help in their recovery and help in their conservation as well. One of the best things you can do is learn to recognise the species and then report sightings of it. So then we know where they are and we know how we can help them too. So there's a number that you can call, and you can also email sightings@speciesAtRisk.ca. Okay, and I have some questions, which I think maybe Jess has answered. Is there any more questions?
Say thank you to Mark for your really great questions in the chat box. They were really well thought out, and I appreciate you asking. If you do have any questions, you can certainly reach out to either Janine or myself. And I am Jessica. Sorry that I haven't shown my face here today, but I really appreciate your involvement in the session.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for joining us. Right. I think that's that then. Thank you again for coming today. And if you have any questions, we're always on email. You can reach out to us at any time. Okay, thanks very much. Bye now.